Hi there, I'm Jack Kelly with the UW-Madison Center for Journalism Ethics. Thanks for checking out our Economy Toolkit for local journalists. Today in our expert interview, I talked to Adie Tomer, a fellow with the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. Adie is an expert on infrastructure, and he shares lots of great information with me about the importance of infrastructure to a local economy, President Joe Biden's American Jobs Plan, and much more. Here's my conversation with Adie Tomer. I hope you enjoy.
But to start, I want to ask, I want to be a little bit more broad. How important is infrastructure to the American economy as a whole? And how important is it to a thriving economy at the local level?
Yeah, it's not hyperbolic to say infrastructure is essential to any kind of thriving economy in any place, whether you're analyzing it from the local level or even national in scale. You just got to think about how your personal day operates in the morning. One of the first things you do is probably turn a faucet or flush a toilet, right? You flick on the lights, hopefully probably after that as your eyes adjust. You start to, if you got kids in the house, you open, or even if you don't, right, you open up the fridge, which most likely is, modern and plugged in. So right away, you're using water and power within 5 to 30 minutes, both of them. You maybe have picked up your phone that's been charging. When you leave your home, especially during non-COVID times, you use transportation of all kinds, right? Whether you're a pedestrian or a bicyclist or you drive a big rig truck, right? Everyone's basically on roads. And of course, during COVID times, we've learned that broadband is an essential utility, right? Which certainly runs on power, but connects us to the world. It's in Maslow's hierarchy, right? Effectively at the bottom is infrastructure, if you start to think about it. So it's essential. I mean, there's no kind of way around it. And you can kind of see this in the nature of a lot of reporting around infrastructure, where we don't report on infrastructure successes because they're effectively implied in our own thinking, right? Your local water utility or stormwater utility, which is sometimes different, the expectation for them is 100% success, right? Which, at least for me and my job, that is not the expectation. These are folks who have zero room for error, because what happens when they have an error is it becomes an above the fold story, right, on failure, because that's effectively what the population has shown their interest in. We know that we can't grow local jobs, have people thrive, if they both can't connect to opportunity, if they can't do that safely, and if we don't have an infrastructure that allows both industries to grow and people to find additional opportunities than what they have now. So what this ends up looking like and why we see the stories resonate is, like a famous story out of Detroit from a few years ago, of a gentleman who couldn't get to work except by taking multiple buses and then walking. I believe it was over an hour at the end or beginning of his trip, depending to go to work. So I think he actually ended up spending more time or almost as much time traveling as he did on the job. And it was a really extreme example. And eventually, someone bought him a car, which became this whole separate story among transit aficionados of, hey, wait, I think the story here is the buses don't work, not don't give this one gentleman a car, right? So we see that on kind of that side, but it's also for businesses. For the most part, our roadway system has been built out to the degree that any business can be successful. One of the elements that seems to be a bigger challenge right now is kind of at the more extreme global trade end, where there are in fact some trade flow issues both inside ports but also just off site to connect them to roadways. So these are pinch points, and in major port markets like Seattle, LA, Houston, New York, right? But it's also at a local level for especially rural agriculture, which can be both small farms, even larger ones, and relatively rural or small town manufacturers, both on site and off, meaning for their workers, is broadband connectivity. Over 70% of farms in the United States do not have a broadband connection, and that limits their ability to trade globally. But also we're hearing more and more about manufacturers who either struggle to get broadband inside their facility or have troubles recruiting people to relatively small towns because, yeah, the facility has broadband, but when they go home, it doesn't, right? And that limits the opportunities for them and their children. So, it's hard to spin infrastructure as a positive story. It's naturally kind of one of deficit is when it resonates. But some of those deficit kind of stories can be spun in such a way to show, hey, how can we use infrastructure to build out a more prosperous economy in the future?
Sure. And I guess then, kind of a natural follow-up in this conversation. President Joe Biden and Democrats in Washington, the American Rescue Plan is in the rear view, their first multi-trillion-dollar legislation. Now they've turned their attention to infrastructure with the American Jobs Plan. What advice do you have for local journalists who look at a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure bill across 10 years? What advice do you have for journalists as they look at a bill like that and try to localize it to their own community and try to kind of portray what the impact of an investment like that could be?
Yeah, it's a great question. Number one is lessons for the American Job Plan live in the local response, which in this case is a deployment question around the American Rescue Plan. So the American Rescue Plan is going to be dropping billions of dollars directly to localities around the country. Communities of all sizes, from some of the smallest to the largest, are going to receive significant funding, meaning tens of percents of their normal annual budget. And this is a time when we know that the economy is starting to heat up, but in really positive ways, not necessarily about this somewhat distractionary story about inflation, but actually about people are, right, unemployment is going down again, that businesses are reopening, of course, right? They're seeing patrons come back, and that kind of beautiful cycle that starts when you can kind of feel that economic energy. So as ideally property tax revenues don't hit the dip that they expected, as sales tax revenues come back up, all of a sudden local budgets, city, county, even state, could be flush with cash. And what we also know is the case around infrastructure is there's massive maintenance backlogs. So again, American infrastructure really isn't crumbling. We've kind of tried to convince ourselves of that story, but you just need to travel to many economies across the world, which many folks aren't fortunate enough to do, but to see what actual crumbling infrastructure looks like. But what we do have is maintenance backlogs, and in particular in areas like the snow belt, right, where you just have higher maintenance needs than fair weather places. So how do we accelerate, let's say addressing those potholes, right, or other roadway maintenance projects? How do we remove lead pipes from in particular neighborhoods that have been left behind in terms of water utility investments? So the American Rescue Plan can help us do that, but it's really just the kind of the early warning, in a good way, a good warning of what could come from the American Jobs Plan, which is a significant investment across the four major infrastructure sectors. That's transportation, water resources, energy, and telecommunications, really broadband, into communities, some of which with direct control, that could allow them to functionally reimagine what their communities look like. And that leads to the second part I'd kind of push folks to talk about, is reporters in particular, so meaning questions to ask of local officials, your chambers of commerce, and other folks that really have a seat at the table, local nonprofits, right, who really represent communities, to ask them what's their vision for the future of their region. Infrastructure is an enabler. It's not the end unto itself, right? So if you're looking, let's say it's a region of the country that's trying to attract more development to be downtown, right? Or you want to create new kind of civic spaces. How are the infrastructure projects they're proposing that federal funding could help support, if not entirely pay for? How do they advance those ends? If folks are struggling to get to jobs and car ownership rates aren't high, how are these investments going to improve transit service in the region? If kids have been left out of digital education, or folks have been relying on mobile hotspots that of course aren't permanent, how are the American Recovery Plan and potential, whatever they would call the American Jobs Plan if it goes through Congress, how are they making sure that it actually leads to improved access to the digital classroom? These are easy questions to ask, but they're hard questions to answer. And that's all, to me, always a good sign. You're probably going to get different answers from different folks, especially the public sector is really, it's a good problem for them to have. They have a huge infusion of cash, but they need to, these kind of questions from reporters can actually push forward their thinking to understand, well, what are we debating here and deliberating between? What are those kind of challenging decisions that need to be made, between, we know in infrastructure, there is, it's almost a limitless amount that you could spend. So as big as the numbers are, you still can't build everything. So how are local officials going to think about what they want to choose to do and what might be a secondary priority?
Sure. That's really interesting. It's not only an opportunity to keep a local community informed about a really important development or multiple developments. It's an opportunity to maybe actually drive the developments by asking these questions of local officials. I think that that's a unique perspective that I hadn't heard before, especially about a topic like this, where, you know, the dollar amounts are typically so big. Just, you know, they're just the sheer size of some of these investments is incredible. And then finally, you know, like you kind of alluded to there, infrastructure is a really catch-all phrase. A lot gets folded into the umbrella of infrastructure. What are some of the trends that you're watching? Somebody who studies this, writes about it, researches it almost, you know, every day. What are some of the trends you're watching related to infrastructure that local journalists should be keeping an eye on, you know, especially in their own communities? Just because I think, you know, sometimes things can be missed, or something may seem insignificant, but could be representative of a larger trend. What are some of the things that you're watching for as we go forward?
Yeah, totally. At least the first that comes to mind is the digitalization of everything. You know, many of us who are, I'm like the oldest possible millennial, which makes me kind of old at this point. You know, we have digital fluency, right? We kind of came up, we're the right age in the world that we remember it analog, but really, you know, we don't have to think to type. We kind of intuitively know how to use computers and smartphones, most importantly. So we're comfortable with that digital world. But we know that digitalization is permeating into everywhere, and it will impact everyone. And that has huge impacts in communities across a couple dimensions, but a couple that I'm really curious about, and I think there's the story is really going to come out of local areas that can experiment. So how is your local area using sensors, let's say to optimize traffic lights, right? Redesign streets to, in particular, prioritize pedestrians and their safety. And when I say pedestrian, that's both people walking, but also bike users too, right? So folks are not in a much safer box, right? Big metal box. How are those sensors being used to monitor water utilities, right? And you know, potentially get to leaks before they happen, or minimize the impacts of leaks. You know, probably many folks have heard about net metering, right? So what that means, of course, for water utilities, but more so for energy, right? So how can we save energy through these investments? And then what permeates that entire digitalization conversation, why I start with people, is it inherently leads you to, well, who has access to this digital platform and who can use it most easily? You know, for younger folks, we don't worry about their fluency. They're digitally native at this point. We worry about their access. And in particular, a young individual who may live in a household where, let's say their parents or whomever that had a household can't afford a broadband subscription, or maybe just doesn't even think it's of use. That impacts the child's ability to connect to the digital world. We also worry about on the other side for adults, but especially older adults who either, again, are, you know, relatively speaking, lower income, maybe lower educational attainment. We know that correlates with lower broadband adoption. Well, how are they going to be able to use, you know, new transit routing technology that maybe gives them a cheaper, you know, no one's the bus is coming, or helps them get, you know, a ride-hailing app, right, like an Uber or Lyft, right, to call a ride and maybe save them some time, maybe help them get to their doctor's appointment, right, when no one else could help them. You know, these kind of questions. What I love about digitalization is as omnipresent as it seems right now, it's actually still early days. There is a lot more of our life that's going to digitalize going forward. So this is an endless well of questions you can ask about. And it inherently gets to a part I started with, which the digitalization conversation, even when it's limited, or we're seeing limitations right now, it's inherently optimistic. It's about that kind of, it's kind of that, you can imagine that more futuristic kind of sci-fi style future coming to life. So what does that mean in our community? So I'd ask about digitalization. Another area that is just of, I think, constant pressing concern is the resiliency of our, of basically what we call the built environment. That's a catch-all term for, right, can water systems handle whatever the changing climate might be in the given place where reporters are located? In many parts, especially around the Great Lakes, that actually will mean more water, right? So how can your stormwater systems handle that overflow? Where is that overflow going, right? Is it being dumped into lakes or other freshwater places, especially during extreme events where maybe they don't have the filtration system can't handle it, so they just dump it. I mean, that still happens, right? Decades after, the late 1960s and 1970s big federal laws to help protect waterways. Resiliency means, hey, if we're especially in a higher growth area or in neighborhoods that are being redeveloped, what kind of surfaces are we using to make sure that they're pervious so they can actually allow water to seep in rather than intensify stormwater overflow? My colleague Brad Plumer at the New York Times did an incredible story that everyone should read about urban heat islands, and in particular, how that tends to be correlated with neighborhoods of historic disadvantage, many of which were actually originally redlined, right, for real estate purposes. How can we, frankly, part of climate change is the climate does wonkier and weirder things, but on net, we're getting much warmer, right? So how do we make sure that we have enough tree cover in neighborhoods of those disadvantaged, or that there's enough fresh water available and other resources to make life easier for folks who live in those places? That story can constantly be told because, frankly, a lot of folks don't understand what a changing climate means in their backyard, not just in this kind of macro sense of either more disasters, right, or melting ice caps. Again, very important, but they're so far away, but really physically, right, that it doesn't bring the climate change story home that I think people can understand better. So those are two key features that I'm kind of always watching. A third one, which is really wonky and hard to talk about, but it's worth keeping your focus on. It's what we kind of answered before, but just to stress, is there enough money around, right? Fiscal affairs are really important. Paying for infrastructure is not easy. It's not cheap. But if we don't make these necessary investments, we know it makes life harder, right? So keeping tabs on how much we're investing is always a really important story, although hard to kind of wrap in a resonant way for media consumers.
Sure. Yeah. It's one of those things that, unless you make the investment on an ongoing basis, you're not going to notice how bad things are until they're really bad.
That's right. Yeah. You use the metaphor. It's, would you put an expansion on your house while you need to invest in your roof, right? You probably should take care of your roof first, right? So we're at the stage in the U.S. where we know we need to expand the house a little bit. We probably have some time, but we should definitely take care of our roof first because we're seeing some kind of funny leaks on heavy rain days,
Sure. Adie Tomer, a fellow at the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. Adie, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jack.